Good afternoon, everybody. It's really nice to have you all here, and we're looking forward to tonight's program. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I welcome you to tonight's program, America at a Crossroads, our virtual town hall weekly series. Thanks to our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine, former Supervisor of Los Angeles, Zev Yaroslavsky, David Lehrer, Caroline Kelly, and Rabbi Ken Chazen, and thanks to all of our co-sponsors. Tonight, we are graced with what will no doubt be a stimulating and important conversation between The Atlantic's Barton Gellman and NPR's Madeleine Brand, two extraordinary journalists from whom we can better understand the current state of our American democracy. Thank you to Bart and to Madeleine for joining us, and of course, to our always loyal audience for your continued curiosity, intelligence, and commitment to our democracy. Next week on March 2nd, we will welcome attorneys Benjamin Ginsberg, a longtime GOP election lawyer, and Bob Bauer, former White House counsel to President Obama and co-chair of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. They will be in conversation with longtime, recently retired NPR election correspondent Pam Fessler. Their topic, safeguarding free and fair elections. It should be a very important conversation. On March 16th, Congressman Adam Schiff, who was the first Trump impeachment House manager and who sits on the January 6th House Select Committee, will be joining us to bring us up to date on the work of the committee and current events from his unique perspective. Full unedited recordings of all of our programs can be found on our YouTube channel and on our website. We always provide a link. So look for it in any of our emails. Be sure to look at the activism section of our website. There's a lot of great organizations doing amazing work, and there's volunteer opportunities and opportunities to support pro-democracy organizations. I would ordinarily now be welcoming my amazing partner, the incomparable David Lehrer, but he is traveling and his internet connection was just not good enough. So we're really sorry that he's not here, but I'm going to be telling you what he would have told you. All right, let's see. On March 23rd, we'll have Professor Rick Hasson back, one of the nation's leading authorities on election law, whose op-eds appear regularly in the pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post, together with KCRW's Warren Olney. Rick is the author of a book to be released in 2 weeks called Cheap Speech: How Disinformation Poisons Our Politics. He is a law professor at UC Irvine. The following week, we'll have a special treat. One of the most highly regarded op-ed columnists in the country, E.J. Dionne, will be a regular on the pages of has been a regular on the pages of the Washington Post for almost 30 years. He authored a book to be released next month entitled 100% Democracy, The Case for Universal Voting. That is voting a right or a privilege or a duty? And he'll be talking about that with his co-author, Miles Rappaport, the former Secretary of State of Connecticut and the former president of Common Cause. We continue to seek the very best guests for these programs who can enlighten and inform our understanding of what is happening in the world, both here at home and abroad. Our moderator tonight has been with us more than a dozen times. She is wonderfully talented, and she hosts an award-winning program on NPR station in Santa Monica called Press Play. She's Madeleine Brand. We love her, and I think you guys do too. She always gets to the heart of what our guests have to say, and we are so pleased to have her back tonight. Madeleine?
Janice, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me back. I can't believe it's been that many times. We've just flown by. I'm excited to talk to Barton Gellman in this format. We talked on the show, well, a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago or so. He is an incredibly talented journalist, and I'm honored to be in his company. Among his many professional honors, he has won the Pulitzer Prize, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Before he joined The Atlantic, he was at the Washington Post for 21 years, where he was legal, diplomatic, and military correspondent, Middle East correspondent and military correspondent, and he has written a couple of best-selling books, Dark Mirror, Edward Snowden and the American Surveillance State, and Angler, the Cheney Vice Presidency. It is my pleasure to welcome Barton Gellman and to talk about his Atlantic cover story, January 6th Was Practice. Hi there.
All right, Lynn.
Great to see you. Well, before we get to your article and your warning about the next election, let's just talk about the recent news in Ukraine. And you have, as I just said, been a diplomatic correspondent, military correspondent. So you probably have a lot more institutional knowledge about this part of the world than most of us. What do you see playing out, and how do you rate what Biden has done in terms of his reaction, the sanctions? Are they tough enough?
What I see is that Biden has brought in a team of pros, and they had a tall order after the Trump presidency in pulling the EU and NATO back together into firm alliance with the United States. Europe was quite alarmed by what had happened in the United States. The organization at NATO was more and more unsure of its mission. And what's happened is the Russian threat has pulled everyone together. Biden and his team have done a really good job of coordinating with the allies and bucking up their resolve to respond strongly to the Russian aggression. So Germany, for example, which has a very powerful economic interest in a gas pipeline from Russia, has been persuaded at least to suspend the operation of that pipeline as part of the sanctions. And they're now waiting to see whether Putin is going to take the next step and the step after that. I believe if he does, he will face a regime of economic sanctions that far exceed anything that's ever been done with Russia before.
Do you think that would be enough to make him think twice about going all the way?
No, I'm afraid I don't. I think it's going to cripple his country economically, and it's going to raise the cost of this war. But in his very strange and rambling speech the other day, he made clear that he believes that Ukraine is an integral part of Russia. I mean, this is a fantasy. It's an independent state, a democratic ally in the heart of Europe. But he does not acknowledge its right to exist as a country. He believes it's part of Russia. He's got the means right now, at least in the short term, to conquer the country, to take the capital. And looks like he's planning on doing it by slices. So his first step is to recognize chunks of Ukraine with large ethnic populations as independent states and send quote unquote peacemakers to make sure that Ukraine does not protect its sovereign territory. We'll have to see what the next step is, but I don't believe sanctions are going to stop him.
So that gives us to Trump and his reaction. So he popped up on a conservative talk show, speaking to the host there, who referred to him as Mr. President, and Joe Biden is the occupant of the White House. And he praised Putin yesterday as savvy. He said we could use that on our southern border, and not surprising at all that he would praise Putin, but shocking that he did, I guess, on this day. What do you think, besides getting attention and getting everyone talking about him, what do you think his goal is in doing that, in saying that?
No, I think he just speaks his mind. With Trump, it's always right there on the nose. You never have to guess what he really means or what he really thinks. He praised Putin as a genius at giving a fake cover story. He said, look how smart it was for him to recognize independent Russian states inside Ukraine. Wasn't that very clever of him? While he's actually launching a war of unprovoked aggression in violation of international law. Isn't it very clever, the cover story he's given himself? Nice job, Putin. That's one of the things that Trump admires, is smart marketing while you're doing evil deeds.
And a strong man. He likes dictators.
He likes dictators. He likes military strength. He doesn't like Ukraine.
Yeah, for obvious reasons.
So there's nothing but celebration for Trump in this whole situation right now.
But is he also signaling to his base? Because there's also all of this chatter and talk on Fox News, on Tucker Carlson, for example, on all sorts of right-wing outlets basically praising Putin, or at least not condemning him.
Well, he's actually confusing the political argument because he's saying what he really thinks about Putin. The Republican Party is split between its traditional position of skepticism of Russia and hostility to Russian aggression, which still exists in the Republican Party, and then this kind of authoritarian, loving Tucker Carlson brand of hero worship of authoritarians like Putin. And it's unclear if you approve of what's happening between Russia and Ukraine right now, as Trump clearly does, that it's unclear what you're blaming Biden for. And the Republicans have been trying to figure out whether to blame Biden for weakness, for letting this happen on his watch, or to say, well, the US should have no reason to object, which is more or less what Tucker Carlson is saying.
Mm-hmm. Right. So Trump yesterday saying, condemning Biden, but saying, by the way, this never would have happened if I was there, but saying, oh yeah, this is a good thing. I'm praising Putin, but it never would have happened if I were in charge, which is mixed message.
Having it always.
Okay, let's get to your article. Your colleague George Packer wrote an essay preceding your huge article, and he basically says it's easier for him to imagine the Earth destroyed by global warming than it is to imagine the end to our democracy, the end to our 250-year-long experiment in self-government. And I think many of us really can't imagine a coup in America. We all have a collective failure of imagination. It just doesn't happen here. It happens in places where there were monarchs and dictators. But you can imagine this. You have imagined this, and you wrote about it. So actually, what does it look like? What does a coup look like?
It's funny you say that. I can imagine it because part of me can, the reporter in me reported it out and walked myself through how it would happen. But as a citizen, I still find it hard to believe. There's a whole cognitive dissonance going on with me because I don't want to believe that someone could lose an election and nonetheless take power. But Trump supporters and political operatives around the country are doing their best to set the stage for that. And it is becoming increasingly possible. Trump came fairly close to overturning an election last time. And he is actually better positioned now than he was before to succeed if there's another close election in 2024. And that's counterintuitive because you would immediately object, well, he's not the president right now. He doesn't have the executive branch. He doesn't have the powers of the presidency to enlist in his effort. But it turned out that the powers of the presidency were not helpful to him in his effort to overturn the election. The Justice Department, although it came very, very close, did not go along. The military made it clear it was not going to support overturning the election results, despite efforts to have him declare martial law or to have the Department of Homeland Security seize the voting machines. None of that was going to happen. What allowed him to come close was that he is this demagogic leader of a very powerful strain of public opinion, where there are tens of millions of people who he is convinced he actually won the election and who won't take any other answer for it. And he had the ability as a politician to pressure state legislatures to change their results of their elections in their states. His whole strategy depended on the fact that there were about 7 states that are battleground states that Biden won, but that have entirely Republican-controlled state offices. The state House and the state Senate are Republican controlled, and under a peculiar theory of the law that Trump and some of his advocates are pushing, state legislatures have the final say on appointment of electors in a presidential election. So he was trying to get the state legislatures to fire their voters, to throw away the voters' results that gave the election to Biden in their states, and instead to simply appoint Trump electors. And he wanted Vice President Pence to count those alternate electors on January 6th. He's setting the stage for doing that again next time, is the main point.
But he wasn't successful in persuading them. He wasn't successful in persuading Georgia to change its vote count, Republican governor there, Republican Secretary of State. He wasn't successful in Arizona. Mike Pence said no and has reiterated his opposition recently. So there are, I don't know if safeguards, maybe that word is a little too optimistic, but there seem to be people from within his own party who are willing to say no to him.
Well, so your examples are actually very instructive here. In Georgia, the Secretary of State, whose job was to certify the election, Brad Raffensperger, said we've counted once, twice, and 3 times, and Joe Biden won. He famously resisted Trump's notorious telephone call in which Trump sort of begged and threatened him, demanding that he find for Trump enough votes to flip the election results in Georgia. And Brad Raffensperger refused to do that. And Jeffrey Kemp, who's not ordinarily a hero of election lawyers or of certainly of someone like Joe Biden, signed the certification of the actual result. What's happened since then? Trump has recruited someone to run against Kemp and someone to run against Raffensperger, each of them on a platform that says that Trump actually won the last election in Georgia and that they would not have certified Biden's victory. And they are serious candidates who have a reasonable chance of unseating those 2 politicians. Meanwhile, the state legislature, run by Republicans, has passed a law saying that Brad Raffensperger no longer has the power to certify elections. It's not his decision anymore. Instead, it's going to be the decision of a state election board that's appointed by the legislature, by these same Republican politicians who are claiming that Trump really won the election. And in addition to that, they've passed voter restrictions, and they've passed a law that allows them to fire the chief of the election board in each of the counties in the state of Georgia, with specific reference to Fulton County, where Atlanta is, which is a Democratic stronghold. And so what's happening all around the country is that Trump allies are systematically looking for all the points of friction that stopped Trump from overthrowing the election. And they're systematically rooting out those obstacles. They are trying to take control of the referees. Mm-hmm. There's one kind of voter suppression in which you try to reduce the opportunities for your opponents to vote at all. And then there's voter subversion, in which you try to change the rules on the counting of the vote and take political control of that. If you own the referees, it's hard to lose an election, and that's what they're trying to do.
And how will we know if they've been successful in doing that? Will we have to just wait to see what happens after the next presidential election, or will we know beforehand?
Well, you could track at a local, county, and state level all around the country people who are running for office or are looking for appointments to be election supervisors, secretary of state, county board of election supervisor, and so on. And the Republicans are pretty systematically trying to put people in place in those jobs who are prepared to say that black is white and that Trump really won the last election and that they would not have certified the actual voting results if they had been in those jobs before. So you could watch and see how many of those people around the country are entering into positions of power over the vote count. You can look at the progression of legal arguments that give state legislatures the power to appoint electors. So it's true that in the Constitution of the United States, in Article 1, it says that each state shall appoint a number of electors in the manner of the legislature's own choosing. Now, what they choose is they choose to have an election and let the people decide who the electors will be. And that's how it works. You vote for a president. What you're really voting for is the electors for that president. And each state legislature has ceded the power to the people to appoint electors. And Trump allies are advancing a legal theory that would let the legislature take that power back, even after an election, and say, we changed our mind, people, you don't get a vote. We're appointing Trump electors.
So what do you envision if this does come to pass, that there are vying slates of electors in key battleground states? Arizona, for example, sends two slates of electors to Congress on the next January 6th. What do you envision happening?
Well, that's if they even do send two slates of electors. Arizona, Trump's favored candidate for governor, is running on the big lie. A central feature of her platform is that Biden's victory in Arizona was wrongly certified, that he didn't win, that Trump won, that she would have done something about that. She actually claims to have an idea on how retroactively to say that Trump won and put him back on in the White House right now. So maybe Arizona, if Biden runs again, and if he wins Arizona again, maybe the Biden electors don't get sent to the National Archives and to the president of the Senate, because the governor won't sign that certificate and sends instead a slate of electors. Or the Biden electors are sent to Washington and the legislature sends a competing alternative slate. Then it falls to Congress to decide which electors to count, if any. And so the result's it's gonna make a big difference what happens in the midterm elections, who controls the House and who controls the Senate. If the same party controls both, then it controls the decision on which electors to recognize, unless of course it goes to court. The Electoral Count Act is a big mess and full of contradictions and full of unclear passages. So there are a number of scenarios in which there would be no clear answer as to who was the president. And there's a fair amount of interest right now in Washington. There's some bipartisan interest in amending that law and rewriting it to clarify. But as things stand right now, if the Republicans control both the House and the Senate, and they want to recognize a Trump victory regardless of the election outcome, they would seem to have that power.
So talk a little bit about what's happening within the Republican Party, because you have Mitch McConnell recently criticizing the RNC for censuring Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney. As I mentioned earlier, Mike Pence has come out to say Trump was wrong to try to get him to overturn the election. But then you have Kevin McCarthy, who is not doing any of that, and seems to be, in many instances, listening more to Marjorie Taylor Greene than to Mitch McConnell or any of the standard Republicans. So where do you see the center of power now in the Republican Party?
Trump still has overwhelming support in the Republican Party. He's the clear leader of the party. There seems to be some small slippage in public opinion inside the party, and you are seeing small signs of discontent or dissent from people like McConnell every now and then. But Trump clearly still controls the party. 2/3 of the Republican members of the House voted to overturn the election last time around. That's an extraordinary number, who said, notwithstanding the results of the Electoral College, notwithstanding the results of the popular election, they simply tried to make Trump the president. And that is where the core of the party is right now, and because that's where the base of the party is right now. Trump has an extraordinary following out in the country. There are, according to research done by Robert Pape at the University of Chicago, there are more than 20 million people in the country who believe both that the election was rigged and that Trump is the actual legitimate president right now, and that violence is justified to restore Trump to power. They brook no dissent from their elected officials, and almost all Republican elected officials are afraid of them.
You mentioned Robert Pape. He also draws a historical comparison between Trump and Slobodan Milosevic, and saying that they both have evoked and invoked the Great Replacement theory, the conspiracy that is that Jews mainly are encouraging the invasion of non-white immigrants to a white Christian nation. So
right, to displace and replace white Christian voters. That's the core of this racist theory, the Great Replacement. I mean, it's variations of that have been said in American history since at least the close of the Civil War, but it's building speed now, and it's got big promoters in the right-wing media as well. I mean, Tucker Carlson openly invokes the Great Replacement as the actual strategy of the Democratic Party.
So just leaving that aside, because you mentioned Tucker Carlson, he and Steve Bannon are also, Steve Bannon also is a proponent of this. What role are they playing in this, in this, I guess, desire to bring back Trump and to maybe cause another insurrection, coup, whatever you want to call it?
Well, they play, first of all, a legitimating role in creating a myth that January 6th was a largely peaceful expression of political protest by patriots who were angry at the confirmed fact that the election was stolen. That's their view, and that Democrats are using the power of the deep state to oppress conservatives for their beliefs that the election was stolen, and that these innocent patriots from January 6th are being corruptly charged and punished. And by valorizing them as patriots, they are leaving open the question of whether that kind of thing can happen again. Because after all, if you believe that the state is corrupt, the courts are corrupt, the election system is rigged, then what other choice do you have but violence? When someone installs a false pretender to the presidency, if you convince people that all of the mechanisms under the Constitution are broken, then you are implicitly encouraging more violence.
Where would that how would that violence express itself next time around? Do you think it would be another siege of, or attempted siege of the Capitol?
I don't know. I'm glad that I don't have to do too much prediction in my line of work since it's mostly an empirical job. And my crystal ball is no better than anyone else's. What I can say is that there are tens of millions of people who say that violence is justified to restore Trump to power, and are, in Robert Pape's words, they're like dry kindling. That it only takes a spark. They will know what to do next time Trump calls them out, as he did on January 6th, and sets them in a direction and tells them what to do. He, in fact, has already done that, hypothetically. He said maybe a month ago that he's being tormented by multiple witch hunts by multiple prosecutors. For example, in Georgia, prosecutors are looking at whether he committed a federal crime or a crime against Georgia state law by trying to get the Secretary of State to overturn the election results. He said if anybody indicts him, he hopes his supporters will come out in the biggest demonstrations ever seen, biggest, angriest demonstrations ever seen, if he gets indicted. That's not a hard code to crack. I think we understand what he means by that. He certainly understands what he means by that. And a moment like that would be a dangerous moment.
And so a lot of people have talked about the possibility of a civil war, which is, again, I think it's hard for us to imagine that. One argument against that is this is a fringe element. 20 million sounds like a lot, but maybe they say they would justify violence, but wouldn't actually pick up a gun and take to the streets. There isn't a huge economic engine in peril as there was during our Civil War, and that was the slave trade. And throughout our history, Americans have been divided violently so for many periods of our history, and not so, far back in our history. So I guess I'm wondering why this moment is different than in any other fractious moment in our history.
Let's be clear, I don't foresee another civil war. History doesn't repeat itself exactly like that. And we don't have especially geographical boundaries among the contending parties here. We talk about red and blue states, but there are a lot of Democrats in Texas, and there are a lot of Republicans in New York. And in fact, the insurgents on January 6th were likeliest to come from a county in which the election was close. They were likely to come from a county in which Biden squeezed out a victory. And they were also likely to come from a county in which white people demographically were on the decline. So sometime around 2045, according to census data, census projections, white people will no longer be the majority in this country. That can be seen as a hopeful sign of the diversity of a great democracy. But to many, many Trump supporters, that is a catastrophe that is on the way. And in counties where white population is already on the decline, you had the roots of a lot of these insurgents from January 6th. But what would it actually look like? I really don't know. What I know is that we've never had before a presidential candidate who refused to concede defeat in an election. He not only refused to concede it, but made it for more than a year after the election his sort of central focus and central political argument that he'd had the election stolen from him. We've always had people who were disappointed in election results, and we've always had people who actually didn't even believe that their side had lost. But here it's being supported by political elites. It's being supported by a party leader, and almost all of the party's elected officials have gone along either tacitly or enthusiastically. There's hardly a Republican elected official alive right now who is willing to say, as Liz Cheney did, Trump lost the election fair and square. It was a legitimate election. Biden won, and all this talk of a rigged election is made up. Hardly anyone's willing to say that in the Republican Party. And so you have all the angry and disappointed people having their anger validated by the leaders of their party.
So even if the January 6th committee comes out with a scathing report, has the receipts, if you will, that clearly shows that Trump had organized this insurrection and is criminally liable. Even if that happens, you don't think that will change the minds of Republican leaders or even the voters?
I find it hard to believe that the January 6th committee, even though it has 2 Republicans on it, will not be greeted by the Republican Party as a whole as being a partisan weapon trying to smear President Trump and his supporters. You're certainly not going to convince Republicans who believe against all the evidence that the election was rigged, and they're not going to be able to prosecute, even if they find probable cause to believe that crimes were committed. That's not their function. That would be the Justice Department's job. Right now, we don't have a lot of evidence. We have actually exactly 0 evidence that the Justice Department is pursuing criminal charges that go that high.
Why aren't they doing that? I think that is a head scratcher for many people, that Merrick Garland has not been aggressive in investigating and prosecuting people higher up the food chain. Well,
I have to say in fairness that we don't know for a fact that they're not doing it. The Justice Department does know how to keep secrets sometimes. There could be a grand jury at work that is being very cautious about who it's calling in and who it's not. I mean, if it called in Steve Bannon, that would leak. Bannon would leak it. But if it's calling in other players who have something to lose, if they piss off the Justice Department, it's possible that they've got a thorough investigation going on, and they've just been exceptionally good at hiding it. I wish I believed that they did. I don't think I do, but I could be wrong.
Well, let's talk about the Democrats in general. And you write in your piece that Democrats, big and small d, are not behaving as if this threat of another coup is real, and that they are making a grievous mistake. And yet Biden has made a speech where he said that this is the most significant test of our democracy since the Civil War. He said we should be alarmed. The rhetoric is there, but what are they not doing that they need to be doing right now to counter this?
Well, one thing I need to make clear is that I don't have all the answers. I mean, I have my own place in the food chain. I'm a journalist, and I see problems, and I have a platform, and I have a megaphone, and my job is to wave my arms and yell and say, there's something going on that you should all know about. There's a big problem brewing here. It's a good thing for America that I'm not in charge of coming up with the answers. So I wouldn't be very good at it. I do think that Biden gave a very strong speech in July last summer, and he said that he didn't even say Republican, but that the Republican efforts at election subversion, this trying to capture the counting mechanisms, the counting bureaucracy, the legal constitutional instruments of vote counting, that was the greatest threat to democracy since the Civil War. Those are very strong words from an American president. You would think that if you say words like that, that you would make it certainly one of your very top priorities to do something about it. And it was not evident that Biden was doing that. He has since made another speech, and the Justice Department has intervened legally against some of the state legal changes. And Democrats are talking about it more and organizing more. I think since I wrote this in December, there has been a kind of awakening, I would say, to the problem, and you're seeing a lot more attention paid to it. But I still don't see the Democrats doing as much as the Republicans are to capture that election bureaucracy.
Okay, let me get to a couple of questions from our audience. Jean asks, what can we ordinary citizens do?
I think it starts with awareness. It starts with making your elected leaders aware that you're aware. I mean, most people don't know who their state assembly person is, or their state senator is, or their county election supervisor, or their precinct captains. And those people matter. They're going to matter a lot in the 2024 election. And you should get to know who they are, and you should make sure they understand that you're watching. There are organizations that are organizing to prevent democratic subversion, election subversion, and I think you can go out and find some of those and support them if you like. But I think awareness and putting this front and center in the public debate is a big part of it, because hardly any of the politicians who are doing these things are willing to come out and admit that what they want to do is disregard the votes of the voters and appoint a president that the voters didn't vote for. Hardly any of them are willing to put it like that. And so the more they believe that they're being watched and that people are paying attention, the less likely they are to go along with Trump's plans.
And on the right, Steve Bannon is calling for people to do that as well, right? And to work as election monitors and
calling them for them to go and volunteer and to be poll watchers and precinct captains and throughout the whole election administration bureaucracy.
Terry asks, even if the Trump interpretation of the Electoral Count Act prevails, wouldn't it likely end up before the US Supreme Court, and they would probably not sustain his theories, right? I don't know if that's an assumption we can go with, but.
I didn't really have a theory of the Electoral Count Act, which is a law passed in, I want to say, 1887. That describes the mechanisms that are used to carry out the instructions of the 12th Amendment of the Constitution. Essentially, how do you count electoral votes if they're disputed? Some of Trump's legal advisors, if you call them legal advisors, people like John Eastman, took the position, and Sidney Powell as well, another one of Trump's lawyers, took the position that the Electoral Count Act was unconstitutional, that the 12th Amendment gave plenary power to the vice president to decide which electoral votes counted, and that all the other stuff about what Congress would do and how the joint session would operate was irrelevant, because the vice president had this unchallengeable power to count the vote. Now, Republicans won't want to say that next election, because the vice president will be someone else. And so what we're really talking about in a legal dispute maybe something that's called the independent state legislature doctrine. This is the doctrine that says state legislatures are the ones who have the supreme power over who gets appointed electors in a presidential race. And that if the state legislature decides that the election went bad or wasn't properly run or was rigged or however they want to put it, that they can appoint electors different from the electors that would have been appointed if you followed the popular vote in that state. The Supreme Court has 4 justices who've already expressed a certain amount of sympathy toward a version of that doctrine. It's never been tested directly. So we can't be at all sure that the Supreme Court would rule against an effort by Trump along these lines.
Renee asks, is there a margin of victory that Biden or another candidate would need to secure in 2024 to be unassailable?
I do think all the claims about voter fraud and vote rigging and so forth, they get harder and harder to make the bigger the victory margins are. When you have states that are won by 10,000 votes or 20,000 votes, as we had in the 2020 election, it's not very hard to fabricate reasons to doubt the outcome. If there's a blowout election, then things are different. But it's hard to foresee in our closely divided politics and with the state of Biden's political popularity, it's hard to foresee that he's going to win in a landslide if he runs for re-election.
And is that an if, a big if, do you think?
Honestly, I have no idea. I mean, I could mumble a lot more words about it. He's already the oldest president we've had.
Yeah.
It's a hard job. He's lost a few steps. I don't know whether he'll run again. What I do know is that he'll keep on saying he's running again until the very moment he doesn't, if he decides to pull out.
How does one make this rise to the top of most voters' minds? I think most people in this country are concerned with inflation. They say they're concerned with rising crime. They're concerned about pandemic closures, their kids, being schooled at home or not, wearing masks. They're not thinking about democracy. Or they're not thinking about electors. They're not thinking about the Electoral Count Act. So how does this rise to the top so that people do see it as something urgent?
I would say that if you can get people to think concretely about the possibility, which I think is, a genuine practical danger, that the winner of the next presidential election will be declared the loser, and the loser will be placed into office, and the democratic choice of the people will be overthrown. If you convince someone that that's an actual possibility, then they're probably going to pay some attention.
But how do you do that?
My part of it is reporting and writing and bringing it into public attention. And there's a whole civil society out there that has to think about what its part is.
Right. And so I'm wondering if the Democrats have made a misstep by focusing on so many disparate aspects in their various bills that they're not able to pass, even in the voting rights bills, instead of just lasering in on this one issue.
It's easy to convince yourself that whatever issue you care about most is the biggest deal in the world. And there are a lot of important things happening. There's an economy to run. There's an infrastructure bill. There's COVID. There's global warming. You can make the case that any of those is an overriding issue that needs to be given priority. But I think there's something very fundamental about whether we can continue to be a constitutional democracy that functions as it's intended to function. And it's the kind of self-satisfied belief that we have that and can take it for granted and don't have to worry about losing that democracy that needs to be overcome.
Yeah, it's that failure of imagination. It's just impossible to
Exactly, as George Packer described.
think of it that way. It just is not something that we can conceive of at all. And so I guess every time that Trump does something, it becomes one of those, wow, we couldn't even imagine that someone would break this norm or that norm or this norm. Why aren't we used to these norms being broken? So it's been several years that we've had these situations.
Yeah, I mean, the response to Trump so many times over the years has been, what he just did was shocking, but not surprising. How you can be shocked and not surprised at the same time is a trick that Trump is very good at producing that effect. He really doesn't stand for anything except his own self-interest. And I mean, he's a man who told 20,000 lies in the course of one presidency. There's no norm that he respects. There's no law that he respects. He does what he can get away with. If he could have declared martial law and had the military go along with it toward the end of the last presidency after the election, I'm quite sure he would have done so.
And so Joel asks, what personal qualities or policy positions best explain Trump's hold on the Republican Party?
It's nothing to do with policy. I mean, Republicans are happy that his holding power allowed them to carry out certain aspects of their agenda that they've always cared about, cutting taxes and appointing Supreme Court justices being preeminent on that list. But Trump's primary hold is over the imaginations and the beliefs of tens of millions of followers. I mean, he has convinced a catastrophic number of Republicans that the election was stolen. So 2/3 roughly is the most common number that comes out in the polls. 68% is the one I used in my article. Believe that the vote was rigged. That we've never had that. We've never ever had that in that country. A group of people that large who have lost confidence in the constitutional mechanisms of democracy. He's convinced them they believe it deeply. They're not just saying it, and they are angry. And there are Republicans who are afraid of them, and so they don't express any dissent from the view. And there are Republicans who are opportunistically going along with the voter fraud story because they see that it can get them somewhere with the Republican base. But if you were to administer truth serum to Republican elected officials in this country, the overwhelming majority would be obliged to say that Biden won the election, and they understand that. So it's the base, it's the core Republican voters. They believe Trump. They care a lot more about that than they care about their own elected local official or state official. And those local and state officials know it, and so they don't buck Trump.
And the origins of that anger, of that blind faith in Trump. We talked about the idea of the great replacement theory, but it has to be more than that. What else is driving that?
Well, I mean, he's a gifted demagogue. He has taken, I mean, there is a very considerable amount of racial resentment in the Democratic base. There's a feeling of being displaced. There's a feeling of being passed by. There's a belief that the coastal elites don't care about them, only care about themselves, and that people with power are self-dealing and get away with things, and they're not wrong about that. They're not wrong in seeing that the power centers of American society have impunity and are not looking out for their interests. And Trump has convinced them, against all logic, that he's the embodiment of their hopes to fix all that.
So many of those voters a long time ago, or maybe not so long ago, were working class Democratic voters who, like Scranton Joe Biden voters. Is there any chance the Democrats can get them back? And would they want to?
I think, well, would they want to is such an interesting question. I mean, ordinarily a party wants to win whatever constituencies it can, but there's a big argument happening inside the Democratic Party between the left of the Democratic Party, which wants to push the edges of policy and wants to double down on diversity and on minority communities who together form a big part of the Democratic base. And then there are the so-called moderates who want to win back Joe Lunchbox and the Scranton voters that Biden used to command. And they have very different prescriptions for what issues to run on. And Democrats have not made up their minds collectively on the answer to that argument.
This is probably a question you can't answer, but I will pose it. It'll be the last question from the audience. Ted asks, is a 2024 mess a foregone conclusion, or can it be prevented?
Well, I don't think that a coup is a foregone conclusion. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that Trump will lose the election and nonetheless manage to maneuver himself into power. In fact, it's certainly within the realm of possibility. We just have to acknowledge that Trump could win the election fair and square. It's just that he doesn't intend to take that chance. He is doing his best to ensure that the electoral mechanism will place him into power regardless of the outcome. I'm not a fatalist on these things. I think American institutions are capable of holding and are capable of repelling this threat, but it's a very serious threat that needs to be addressed.
Well, we've come to the end of the program. This is normally where we offer you the opportunity to say anything more if you'd like to make some closing remarks.
Well, I would just like to try to end on a more positive note, which is this. I think that there's a big problem. I also think that there is a lot more attention being paid to that problem now than there was last month than there was the month before. I think people are waking up to it. And I think you need actors from all over civil society to respond. But Democratic politicians are paying more attention. Or take a simple example. I just saw posted yesterday. The Washington Post is advertising 5 new positions, which is a fair amount for a newsroom. 5 new jobs. 2 of them are editors and 3 of them are reporters, and they are all focused entirely on defending democracy, on what are the threats to democracy, how are they unfolding around the country, and how to shed light on those. And that's in addition to the people who are already doing that job at the paper. So journalists are also paying more attention to this as a democratic emergency. And the more you shine light on a subject, the more you talk about it, the better off you are.
Well, thank you for shedding light on it. And I appreciate that. I know everyone here appreciates that. And thank you for your reporting Thank you for your writing, and thank you for being here tonight.
Thanks so much for having me.
It was my pleasure. Next week, we have two leading partisan lawyers who have joined together to support free and fair elections. And that's Republican super lawyer Ben Ginsberg and Democratic powerhouse Bob Bauer. They will be interviewed by a woman I used to work with at NPR, Pam Fessler, an expert on elections and election law policy. So definitely stay tuned for that if you have more questions about what you can do and what can possibly be done to avert another attempted coup. I want to thank you so much for joining us, and I will see you again in the not so distant future. I hope. Have a great night.